Jake Morrison never thought his simple job would turn into something so dangerous. He came to the big space station called Zarian Academy as a peaceful messenger from Earth. His job was easier, so he thought. Talk to the smart alien teachers and ask them to let humans join their special school group that taught students from all over the galaxy. The space station was huge and made of some kind of clear crystal that sparkled in the light of 3 different suns. Jake walked through the long halls with his team and felt very small. Everything here was built for creatures much bigger than humans. The doors were tall enough for giants, and the ceilings disappeared into darkness above their heads. Jake had been a soldier before becoming a diplomat. He fought on many worlds at the edge of human space where pirates and rebels caused trouble. But this place made him more nervous than any battlefield. Here the aliens could destroy humanity with just words and votes. The Zarian Council ran this academy, and they were the smartest beings in the known galaxy. They looked like walking pieces of crystal that caught light and threw rainbow colors on the walls when they moved. Each one stood about 10 feet tall, and their voices sounded like music mixed with the sound of breaking glass. Professor Zeph Carroll was the one Jake needed to impress most. This alien taught something called combat studies, which meant he knew everything about how different species fought wars. When Jake first met him, the professor looked down at the human team with what could only be called disgust. The meeting started badly and got worse fast. Jake tried to explain why humans deserved to join the Galactic Education Consortium. He talked about human achievements in science and art and exploration. He mentioned the brave human colonies that pushed into unknown space and built new worlds from nothing. Professor Zeph Carroll listened with growing amusement that Jake could see in the way his crystal body flickered with different colors. When Jake finished his speech, the alien professor began to laugh. The sound was like wind chimes in a storm. Other professors joined the meeting as word spread that something interesting was happening. Soon the great hall filled with dozens of different alien species all come to see the humans make fools of themselves. Jake felt his face turn red but forced himself to stay calm. Professor Zeph Carroll raised one of his crystal arms and the room fell silent. His voice carried clearly to every corner of the massive space when he began to speak. He called humans primitive creatures who could not think properly without their crude tools and weapons. He said humans were like children playing with dangerous toys they did not understand. The worst insult came when the professor declared that humans were too weak and stupid to survive in real combat. He claimed that take away their guns and explosives, and humans would fall to any properly trained warrior from any advanced species. The alien audience made sounds that Jake assumed were laughter. Jake felt anger building in his chest, but knew he had to control it. Getting mad would only prove the professor right about humans being primitive and emotional. But when Zeph Carroll suggested that humans were cowards who hid behind machines because they were too scared to fight with honor, Jake could not stay quiet anymore. Jake stepped forward and spoke in a clear voice that carried throughout the hall. He said that humans were not cowards and had never run from a fair fight. He challenged the professor to prove his claims about human weakness. The hall fell completely silent as every alien turned to stare at the small human who dared to argue with their greatest combat expert. Professor Zeph Carroll seemed delighted by this turn of events. His crystal body flashed bright colors as he considered the situation. Then he made an offer that would change everything. He proposed a formal combat trial between one human and the Academy's greatest warrior. The fight would follow ancient rules with no modern weapons allowed. Only natural abilities and traditional fighting methods would be permitted. The winner of this trial would decide humanity's fate. If the human won, then Earth would be granted full membership in the consortium with all the benefits that brought. If the human lost, then humanity would be banned from ever applying again and would be marked as an inferior species in all official records. Jake knew this was a trap, but also saw it was the only chance humanity would get. The other professors were already nodding agreement with Zeph Carroll's proposal. They seemed excited at the chance to watch a human get destroyed in combat. Jake looked back at his team and saw fear in their eyes, but also trust that he would make the right choice. Without hesitation, Jake accepted the challenge. The hall exploded with excited chatter as aliens discussed this unexpected development. Jake heard some of them already placing bets on how quickly he would lose. Professor Zeth Carroll smiled, which was a terrifying sight on his crystal features. The professor explained that Jake would face Krexvalar, who was the Academy's combat champion. This creature had been designed by the galaxy's best scientists to be perfect at fighting. It had never lost a single battle and had defeated warriors from dozens of different species. Jake would have 3 days to prepare himself before the trial began. As the meeting ended and aliens filed out discussing the upcoming spectacle, Jake realized what he had gotten himself into. He was going to fight some kind of super soldier created by advanced science while he had nothing but his basic human body and whatever fighting skills he could remember. His team gathered around him with worried faces. Lisa Grant, the mission scientist, shook her head and asked what he was thinking. Jake looked around at the crystal walls and alien architecture and gave the only answer he could. He said that sometimes you have to take a stand even when the odds are against you. Besides, he added with more confidence than he felt, humans had been fighting for thousands of years before they ever met aliens. Maybe it was time to show the galaxy what that experience was worth. Jake spent the first day of his 3-day preparation time trying to learn everything he could about his opponent. The Zarian Academy had extensive records about Krexvalar, and they were happy to share them since they believed it would make no difference in the outcome of the fight. Krexvalar was not born like normal creatures, but instead built in laboratories by teams of scientists working for over 50 years. They took the best parts from different warrior species across the galaxy and combined them into one ultimate fighting machine. The creature stood 13 feet tall and weighed as much as a small vehicle. Its body was covered in natural armor that could stop bullets and energy blasts. The armor plates could shift and move to protect vital areas when sensors detected incoming attacks. 6 arms sprouted from its torso, each one strong enough to crush steel. The hands ended in claws that could cut through almost any known material. But the most frightening thing about Krexvalar was its mind. The scientists had given it intelligence far beyond normal animals, but focused entirely on combat. It could analyze an opponent's fighting style within seconds and adapt its own tactics to counter any strategy. It processed information faster than most computers and never got tired or made mistakes from emotion. Jake studied video recordings of previous fights and felt his confidence drain away with each one he watched. The creature moved with impossible speed for something so large. It had fought warriors wearing advanced armor and carrying energy weapons and destroyed them all without taking serious damage. How was a human with bare hands supposed to compete against such a perfect killing machine? Lisa Grant found Jake in the small room they had been given for preparation. She carried a datapad filled with research and had an excited look on her face that surprised him. She said she had been studying the Academy's historical records and found something very interesting about Zarian culture. According to her research, the Zarians had completely eliminated physical combat from their society over 2,000 years ago. They considered hand-to-hand fighting to be primitive and wasteful when advanced technology could settle disputes more efficiently. Their combat studies focused entirely on weapons and machines and vehicles, but never on using the body itself as a weapon. This meant that while they understood how to build creatures like Krexvalar, they had forgotten what fighting actually looked like when stripped down to its most basic level. They thought in terms of natural weapons like claws and teeth versus artificial weapons like guns and swords. The idea that an unarmed being could be dangerous simply did not exist in their thinking. Jake began to understand what this meant for his chances. The Zarians saw him as completely helpless because he carried no weapons and had no natural armor or claws. They could not imagine that a human body properly trained could be more dangerous than many weapons. This blindness might be the only advantage he had. Over the next 2 days, Jake pushed his body harder than he had in years. The Academy provided a training area, but it was designed for much larger beings, so everything felt awkward and oversized. Jake ignored the discomfort and focused on remembering skills he had not used since his youth. When Jake was young, his grandfather had insisted he learn traditional martial arts alongside modern military training. At the time, Jake thought it was old-fashioned and useless in an age of plasma rifles and energy shields. His grandfather was a stubborn old man who believed the ancient ways still had value even in a high-tech world. Now, Jake was grateful for those lessons as muscle memory slowly returned. He practiced basic punches and kicks until his knuckles bled and his shins ached. He worked on footwork patterns that would let him move around a larger opponent and avoid getting trapped in one place. Most importantly, he tried to remember the mental discipline that separated trained fighters from angry brawlers. His grandfather had always said that fighting was 10% physical and 90% mental. The body could only do what the mind commanded, and a calm, focused mind would always defeat a panicked, emotional one. Jake spent hours in meditation trying to find the quiet center his grandfather had taught him to access. Several times during his training, Jake noticed alien observers watching him through the transparent walls of the training area. They seemed confused by his movements, and he could hear them discussing what they saw. To them, it looked like meaningless ritual dancing that served no practical purpose. Professor Zeth Carroll visited on the second day to check on Jake's progress. The crystal alien stood at the observation window for nearly an hour watching Jake practice forms and exercises. His body flickered with what Jake had learned was amusement as he observed the human's preparations. When Jake finished his workout, the professor entered the training area. His voice carried that musical quality that made it hard to tell if he was being serious or mocking when he spoke. He said he was impressed by Jake's dedication to his primitive customs, but warned that ritual movements would not save him from Krexvaller's claws. Jake decided to be honest with the professor about his concerns. He asked why the Xerians were so confident in their champion when they had never actually tested it against human fighting methods. Professor Zeth Carroll's response revealed just how little the aliens understood about what they were dealing with. The professor explained that they had analyzed human military tactics and found them crude but effective when supported by proper equipment. However, without weapons, humans became no more dangerous than any other weak species that relied on tools instead of natural abilities. He said that Krexvaller had been designed specifically to counter armed opponents, so an unarmed human would present no challenge at all. This conversation confirmed what Lisa had discovered in her research. The Xerians literally could not conceive of unarmed combat as anything more than desperate flailing by creatures too weak to have proper weapons. They had studied human soldiers with guns, but never human fighters with empty hands. Jake thanked the professor for his time and returned to his training with new determination. If the aliens wanted to underestimate human martial arts, then he would let them. Better to be seen as harmless right up until the moment he proved them wrong. On his final night before the trial, Jake sat quietly in his room and thought about everything his grandfather had taught him. The old man had lived through wars where technology failed and soldiers had to rely on basic skills to survive. He understood that weapons could be lost or broken, but knowledge and training stayed with a person forever. Jake realized he was not just representing humanity in this trial. He was carrying forward thousands of years of human fighting wisdom that had been tested in every kind of conflict imaginable. Win or lose, he would show the galaxy that humans were more than just clever tool users. They were warriors who had earned their place in the universe through strength and skill that came from within. Jake woke up on the morning of his final preparation day feeling different than he had in years. His body ached from 2 days of intense training, but his mind felt clearer than it had since his grandfather died. As he moved through his morning routine, he found himself thinking in ways that reminded him of his youth when every movement had purpose and every breath was controlled. The training room felt smaller now, not because it had changed, but because Jake had remembered how to use space efficiently. He began his practice session with the most basic exercises his grandfather had taught him, starting with simple breathing patterns that would calm his mind and prepare his body for what was to come. His grandfather used to say that breathing was the foundation of everything in combat. A fighter who could not control his breath could not control anything else. Jake spent an hour just focusing on drawing air deep into his lungs and releasing it slowly while keeping his heart rate steady. This was not exciting training, but it was essential. Next came the fundamental stances that form the base of all martial arts. Jake moved from one position to another, remembering how each one served a different purpose in combat. The horse stance built leg strength and stability. The cat stance allowed quick movement in any direction. The bow stance provided power for forward attacks. Each position had been refined by countless generations of fighters. As Jake practiced these basics, he began to feel the return of instincts he had not used in decades. His grandfather had drilled these movements into him until they became automatic responses that required no conscious thought. Now that training was awakening like a sleeping giant in his muscles and bones. The footwork came next, and this was where Jake started to understand how he might survive against a creature like Krexvalar. Boxing footwork taught him to move at angles that made him hard to hit while keeping him in position to strike back. He practiced slipping imaginary punches and circling away from larger opponents just as his grandfather had shown him. Wrestling and judo had given him skills for dealing with size disadvantages that would be crucial in the coming fight. Jake worked through takedown techniques that used an opponent's weight against them. He practiced throws that could send even massive creatures flying if applied at the right moment with proper leverage, but it was the ground fighting that might save his life if everything else failed. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu had taught him that a smaller fighter could control and defeat larger opponents if they understood joint locks and choke holds. Jake practiced submission techniques on imaginary opponents, visualizing how to wrap his arms around thick alien necks or hyperextend joints that bent the wrong way. The striking arts provided the tools he would need to damage his opponent despite the size difference. Boxing had taught him to throw punches with his whole body behind them, not just his arms. Muay Thai had shown him how to use knees and elbows as devastating close-range weapons. Karate had given him precise techniques for attacking vital points that could disable an opponent with minimal force. Each martial art his grandfather had insisted he learn now revealed its purpose in the coming battle. They were not separate fighting systems, but different tools in the same toolkit designed to turn a human body into a complete weapon, capable of dealing with any threat. Jake began to understand why his grandfather had been so insistent about learning them all. As the day progressed, Jake noticed that alien observers were gathering in larger numbers to watch his training. Word had spread throughout the academy that the human was preparing for his trial in strange ways that none of them understood. Professor Zeth Carroll arrived with a group of other faculty members, who seemed eager to witness what they assumed would be amusing primitive rituals. Jake decided to give them something to think about. He began practicing combinations that flowed from one technique into another in ways that showed how the different martial arts worked together. A boxing jab set up a judo throw, which led to a ground control position that could end in a submission hold. The aliens watched with growing confusion as they tried to understand what they were seeing. One of the professors asked Zeth Carroll what purpose these movements served, since they appeared to have no practical application in real combat. The combat studies expert explained that humans often engaged in ritual behaviors to calm their minds before facing death. He assured his colleagues that these dance-like movements would be useless against a properly designed warrior. Jake heard this conversation and smiled as he continued his practice. The aliens were so focused on analyzing his techniques as individual movements that they completely missed how they connected into a comprehensive fighting system. They saw kicks and punches and throws as separate things rather than parts of a flowing sequence that could adapt to any situation. This blindness gave Jake hoped that his plan might actually work. If the Xerians could not understand what they were looking at, then Krexvalar would also be unprepared for what it would face in the arena. The creature had been programmed to fight against weapons and natural attacks, but not against techniques that turned the defender's own body into multiple weapons working in perfect coordination. As evening approached, Jake shifted his focus from physical training to mental preparation. He spent time in deep meditation, accessing the calm state of mind that his grandfather had called the warrior's peace. In this state, fear and doubt faded away, leaving only clear thinking and perfect awareness of the present moment. Jake visualized the coming fight over and over, seeing himself moving around his massive opponent and finding openings in its defenses. He imagined different scenarios and planned his responses to each one. By the time he finished this mental training, he felt ready for whatever the trial would bring. His teammates visited him that evening to offer support and encouragement. Lisa brought new information about Krexvaller's previous fights that might help him identify weaknesses. The others just wanted to let him know they believed in him even if they did not fully understand how he planned to win. Jake appreciated their concern but found himself feeling strangely calm about the whole situation. His grandfather used to say that a warrior's greatest strength came from accepting that he might die while still fighting with everything he had. Jake had found that acceptance, and with it came a freedom from fear that made him more dangerous than any weapon could. That night, Jake slept deeply and dreamed of his grandfather teaching him one final lesson. In the dream, the old man smiled and told him that he had learned everything he needed to know. The rest would depend on whether he trusted in the wisdom of countless generations of human fighters who had faced impossible odds and found ways to survive. When Jake woke up on the morning of the trial, he felt like a different person than the one who had arrived at the academy just days before. He was still the same human diplomat, but now he carried within himself the accumulated knowledge of every martial artist who had ever lived. Today, he would find out if that was enough. The arena filled with more spectators than Jake had expected. Representatives from dozens of alien species had come to watch what they all assumed would be a brief and entertaining demonstration of human inferiority. The massive circular space could hold thousands of beings, and every seat was taken with more creatures standing in the aisles, hoping to get a view of the action. Jake walked through the tunnel that led from the preparation rooms to the arena floor and felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. The noise from the crowd was overwhelming as different species made their versions of excited chatter. Some of the sounds were musical, while others resembled machinery grinding together. All of them seemed to express the same anticipation of watching a spectacle. The arena itself was a perfect circle carved from the same crystal material as the rest of the academy. The floor was smooth and level with no obstacles or weapons scattered around. High above the fighting area, the Zarian Council sat on their elevated platform, where they could observe everything while remaining safe from any violence that might occur below. Jake wore simple training clothes that allowed him complete freedom of movement. His feet were bare so he could feel the ground beneath him and maintain perfect balance. He carried no equipment of any kind since the rules forbade all artificial aids. Everything he needed for this fight was contained within his own body and mind. Professor Zeth Carroll's voice boomed across the arena as he announced the rules of combat. No weapons or technological devices would be permitted. The fight would continue until one participant submitted or was rendered unable to continue. Medical teams stood ready to intervene if necessary, but they would not interfere unless someone was clearly dying. The professor then introduced Krexvaller to thunderous approval from the alien spectators. Jake heard the creature before he saw it as heavy footsteps echoed through the tunnel on the opposite side of the arena. When it finally emerged into the light, Jake had to fight down a moment of pure terror at what he was facing. Krexvaller was even larger than the recordings had suggested. It stood over 13 feet tall with a body that seemed to be made entirely of muscle and natural armor. Its 6 arms moved independently as it tested its reach and flexibility. The claws on each hand were as long as kitchen knives and looked sharp enough to cut through steel. The creature's head was proportionally small for its body, but Jake could see intelligence burning in its black eyes as it studied him across the arena floor. This was not a mindless beast, but a thinking opponent that would analyze his every move and adapt its tactics accordingly. Jake realized he would get very few chances to surprise this enemy. As Krexvaller moved around its side of the arena, Jake noted how it carried itself. Despite its enormous size, it moved with perfect balance and coordination. The scientists who built it had given it speed to match its strength, and Jake could see that it would be able to react quickly to anything he tried. The betting among the spectators reached a frenzy as aliens placed wagers on how long the human would survive. Jake heard numbers being called out in various languages, but he did not need translation to understand that no one was betting on him to win. The odds seemed to be focused entirely on whether he would last 30 seconds or a full minute. Professor Zeth Carroll called for silence, and the massive crowd gradually quieted until the only sound in the arena was the steady breathing of the two fighters. Jake used this moment to center himself and access the calm mental state his grandfather had taught him. Fear and doubt fell away, leaving only clear awareness of the present moment. The signal to begin came without warning as lights flashed around the arena perimeter. Krexvalar immediately charged forward with terrifying speed, determined to end the fight quickly. Its 6 arms spread wide to prevent Jake from escaping to either side, while its claws aimed for what should have been killing strikes. But Jake was not where the creature expected him to be. Years of boxing training had taught him to read body language and anticipate attacks. He saw the charge coming before Krexvalar fully committed to it, and used footwork to slip to his left while staying just outside the reach of those deadly claws. Jake's first strike was a simple jab aimed at what appeared to be a nerve cluster on the creature's right arm. He had studied the anatomy recordings carefully and identified several points where even light pressure might cause temporary paralysis. His fist connected exactly where he intended, and Krexvalar's entire right side suddenly went limp. The arena fell completely silent as thousands of spectators tried to process what they had just witnessed. Their perfect warrior had been damaged by a single punch from the supposedly helpless human. Jake used their confusion to his advantage and immediately followed up with more precise strikes to other vulnerable points. Krexvalar recovered quickly from the initial shock and began to fight more cautiously. It had been programmed to adapt to opponent tactics, and Jake could see it analyzing his movements, looking for patterns it could counter. The creature began using its remaining 5 arms to create defensive barriers. While probing for openings in Jake's guard, Jake realized he needed to constantly change his approach to prevent the creature from adapting to any single strategy. He switched from boxing footwork to wrestling techniques, grabbing one of Krexvalar's arms and using leverage to throw the massive creature off balance. The arena shook when 13 feet of bioengineered warrior crashed to the crystal floor. Before Krexvalar could recover, Jake transitioned to ground fighting techniques his grandfather had taught him. He wrapped his legs around the creature's massive torso and began working for a chokehold that would cut off blood flow to its brain. The alien audience gasped as they watched their champion struggle against holds they did not understand. Krexvalar's strength eventually allowed it to break free from Jake's grappling attempts, but not before taking more damage than it had ever experienced in previous fights. Jake could see confusion in the creature's eyes as it tried to process fighting methods that had never been programmed into its tactical database. The battle continued with Jake using every technique his grandfather had taught him. When Krexvalar tried to grab him, Jake used judo throws to send it flying. When it attempted to pin him down, he applied joint locks that forced it to retreat or risk permanent damage. Each martial art provided tools for dealing with different aspects of his opponent's attack. What amazed the watching aliens most was how Jake seemed to flow from one fighting style to another without any break in rhythm. Boxing combinations led seamlessly into wrestling takedowns, which transitioned into submission holds that forced Krexvalar to defend in ways it had never needed to before. Jake's grandfather had always said that the human body was the most versatile weapon ever created if properly trained. Now Jake was proving that lesson as he turned himself into a precision instrument of combat that could adapt to any situation. The creature that had been designed to be unbeatable was learning that there were forms of combat its creators had never imagined. As the fight progressed, Jake began to see patterns in Krexvalar's movements that suggested growing frustration and confusion. The creature had been built to dominate through overwhelming force, but Jake's techniques were neutralizing that advantage while creating new problems the alien scientists had never considered. The arena remained silent except for the sounds of combat as thousands of beings watched their assumptions about human weakness being systematically destroyed by one man who carried the wisdom of countless generations of human fighters. The turning point came when Krexvalar made a critical mistake born of frustration and confusion. The bioengineered warrior had never faced an opponent who seemed to have an answer for every attack it attempted. Jake's martial arts techniques were unlike anything in its tactical database, and the creature's adaptive programming was struggling to find effective counters. In its growing desperation, Krexvalar abandoned the careful, measured approach it had been taught and reverted to brute force tactics. It charged forward with all 6 arms extended, hoping to overwhelm Jake through sheer aggression. This was exactly the kind of mistake that Jake's grandfather had taught him to watch for. An exploit. Jake stepped inside the creature's reach using boxing footwork that his grandfather had drilled into him until it became instinctive. The key was timing and distance. Move too early and the opponent could adjust. Move too late and those claws would tear him apart. Jake moved at precisely the right moment, slipping past the creature's guard like water flowing around a rock. His left hook connected with Krexvalar's temple at the exact spot where Lisa's research had identified a major nerve center. The punch was thrown with perfect technique, using Jake's entire body to generate force rather than just his arm. At the same moment, his right uppercut found another vulnerable point that sent electrical signals throughout the creature's nervous system. The combination was devastating. Krexvalar's massive body shuddered as conflicting nerve impulses confused its motor control systems. The creature that had been designed to be the perfect warrior suddenly could not coordinate its movements properly. It swayed on its feet like a giant tree about to fall. Jake did not wait to see if his opponent would recover. His grandfather had taught him that in real combat there was no such thing as fighting fair when life was at stake. Jake followed up with a series of precise strikes to additional nerve clusters that Lisa had identified in her research. Each blow was calculated to maximize damage while minimizing the energy Jake had to expend. Krexvalar tried to fight back, but its body was no longer responding to commands from its brain. The bioengineered nervous system that had been designed to process information faster than any computer was overloaded by sensations it had never been programmed to handle. The creature's legs buckled and it crashed to the arena floor with a sound like thunder. Jake immediately moved to a dominant position, using Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu techniques to control his fallen opponent. He wrapped his arm around the creature's thick neck, applying a blood choke that would render it unconscious within seconds if it did not submit. Krexvalar struggled briefly, then went limp as its oxygen starved. Brain shut down to protect itself. The arena remained silent for several heartbeats as thousands of alien spectators tried to process what they had witnessed. Their greatest warrior had been systematically dismantled by a creature they considered primitive and weak. The human who should have been torn apart in seconds was standing victorious over the champion that had never known defeat. Professor Zeth Carroll's crystal body flickered rapidly through different colors as he struggled to accept what his own eyes had shown him. The combat studies expert who had confidently predicted human failure was forced to acknowledge that every assumption he had made was completely wrong. Slowly, the silence gave way to a growing murmur of conversation as different species discussed what they had seen. Jake heard amazement and confusion in their voices as they tried to understand how their calculations could have been so far off. Some of them began asking questions about human fighting methods that revealed they had never imagined such techniques could exist. Jake helped Krexvalar to its feet once the creature regained consciousness. This gesture of respect between warriors was another human tradition that surprised the watching aliens. They had expected the victor to humiliate his defeated opponent, but instead Jake showed the kind of honor that his grandfather had taught him was essential to true martial arts. Krexvalar looked at Jake with what might have been respect in its alien eyes. The creature had been built to understand combat, and it recognized that it had been beaten by superior technique rather than luck or trickery. Jake nodded to his former opponent, acknowledging the skill and courage it had shown even in defeat. The Zarian Council descended from their elevated platform to make the official announcement that everyone already knew. Jake Morrison of Earth had won the trial by combat, and humanity would be granted full membership in the Galactic Education Consortium. But Professor Zeth Carroll had an additional announcement that surprised everyone, including Jake. The combat studies professor requested that Jake establish a new department at the academy dedicated to what he called human combat philosophy. For The first time in over 2,000 years, the Xerians wanted to learn fighting techniques from another species. They had witnessed something that their advanced science could not explain, and they needed to understand how it worked. Jake accepted the position knowing that he would be teaching more than just fighting techniques. He would be sharing the human understanding that true strength came from within rather than from external tools or weapons. The martial arts his grandfather had taught him were not just about combat, but about discipline and mental control and spiritual development. Over the following months, Jake's classes became the most popular at the academy. Students from dozens of different species came to learn what they now called the human way of fighting. Jake taught them the basic principles his grandfather had shared with him, but also made sure they understood the philosophy behind the techniques. The aliens were fascinated to learn that human martial arts had developed not in laboratories, but through centuries of actual combat experience. Each technique had been tested and refined by countless generations of fighters who faced real opponents in life and death situations. This practical evolution had created fighting systems that were more effective than anything that could be. Designed by pure theory, Jake's students struggled at first to understand concepts that seemed obvious to humans. The idea that weakness could be turned into strength by using proper leverage was revolutionary to species that had always relied on raw power. The notion that mental discipline was more important than physical ability challenged everything they thought they knew about combat, but gradually the alien students began to grasp what Jake was teaching them. They learned that the human body was indeed the most versatile weapon ever created when properly trained and guided by a calm, focused mind. They discovered that fighting was not about destroying opponents, but about neutralizing threats while maintaining honor and self-control. Word of Jake's success spread throughout the galaxy, and other institutions began requesting human instructors to teach their own combat programs. Humanity went from being seen as primitive tool users to being recognized as masters of the most fundamental form of warfare. The species that aliens had dismissed as weak became the teachers of warriors throughout known space. Jake often thought about his grandfather during those early months of teaching. The old man had been right about the value of ancient knowledge in a high-tech universe. Sometimes the oldest ways were indeed the most effective, especially when facing opponents who had forgotten that true strength came from within rather than from the tools you carried. The victory at Xerian Academy proved that underestimating any opponent was a dangerous mistake that even the most advanced civilizations could make. It showed that wisdom and tradition could triumph over science and engineering when applied with skill and determination. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the human spirit, when properly trained and focused, was a force that no amount of technology could defeat. Jake's grandfather would have been proud to see his teachings spread across the galaxy and help other species discover the warrior's path that led to true strength. The ancient martial arts that had seemed obsolete in an age of energy, weapons had found new purpose among the stars as humanity shared its greatest gift with the wider universe.